Friends, we are very happy to inform you that e-modules are prepared for B.Ed program at Telangana by the School of Education, Osmania University under Pandit Madan Mohan Malaviya National Mission on Teachers and Teaching Scheme MHRD New Delhi. It's indeed our pleasure to share with the teacher educators and the prospective teachers and get maximum benefit out of it. It's a first of its attempt by us. We continue to add many more such lessons to share with you all.
Welcome everyone to this module on phenomenology and perception. Through this module we're going to look at philosophy in general and then where phenomenology fits in with philosophy and what are the roles of perception and experience within phenomenology. We're also going to compare and contrast Western phenomenology with Indian phenomenology. This is going to be a very interesting segment. As you can see, philosophy has several branches. Philosophy, has branches in ethics. Then it has separate philosophy of language. And there's mathematical logic. There's philosophical logic. There is what is known as epistemology, the study of how knowledge is constructed. Then there is ontology, classifying various aspects into different categories and hierarchies. Then comes phenomenology, and phenomenology is the science, it is the philosophy of perception. How do we understand what we understand? And what happens through experiences, how are our sensory organs and our experiences entwined with each other. Then comes the field of aesthetics, where we kind of understand what beauty is, what sublimity is, our aesthetic sensory perception, and it's closely related to phenomenology. Then comes applied ethics, which draws from the field of aesthetics, and together this whole loop connects various branches of philosophy and is also known as theory of knowledge. And from this theory of knowledge, we are specifically looking at one branch, that is phenomenology. So phenomenology is the philosophical study of structures of experience and consciousness. Now you may ask, does experience have a structure? Does consciousness have a structure? Well, yes and no. Consciousness can only be, grasped through experience. So in the Western world, consciousness is kind of thought of as a faculty of the mind, whereas in the Indian systems, we look at consciousness as ever pervading. It is not a faculty of the mind, it is beyond the mind. However, whether it is the Western paradigm or the Indian paradigm, experience is considered crucial in understanding consciousness. Whether you consider consciousness a mental faculty of mental awareness, or whether you consider consciousness as ever pervading and beyond the mind or the mental awareness, both are rooted in experience. Now let's look at phenomenology in the West first. As a philosophy, phenomenology in the West started from hermeneutics, from interpretation of their theology, and that kind of phenomenology in the Western paradigm typically roots itself in a lot of their scriptures. Then in about 1920, even before this kind of hermeneutic phenomenology came into the picture, started a movement called transcendental phenomenology. It gained momentum post the Second World War. And this is also known as post-World War II positivism. And in transcendental phenomenology, they put a lot of focus on the consciousness aspects beyond the mind. This was very much connected to the Eastern systems of understanding of consciousness and experience. And there was a solid conflict. There was like a very strong conflict between the hermeneutics that came out of the scriptures versus the transcendental phenomenology that was rooted in experience. But out of this conflict came out a new school of phenomenology called existential phenomenology, and this was spearheaded by Merleau-Ponty and Jean-Paul Sartre. And existential phenomenology is very much aligned with the Indian ideas about consciousness and experience. So there we have a common point for the Western phenomenological philosophical grounding to merge with the Indian phenomenology and philosophical grounding. To begin with, we're not going to go into details of the hermeneutics. We're just going to understand that hermeneutics came out of the Bible and scriptures in the West. However, transcendental phenomenology that was spearheaded by Edmund Husserl, he suggested that phenomenology is the science of consciousness, that there is something called consciousness that is ever pervading and it is beyond the faculty of the mind. And there was a lot of opposition to his ideas. Nevertheless, this school of philosophy, even though it was not very popular, it still prevailed. And as a result of this tension between the hermeneutical, philosophical, phenomenological angle versus the consciousness angle from the transcendental phenomenology, came several aspects of how phenomenology should be studied. So out of these two different schools, the school of hermeneutics that drew its phenomenological base from the scriptures and the Bible versus the transcendental phenomenology that rooted itself in the idea of consciousness, out of that conflict emerged a very systematic approach of studying phenomenology. So they challenged each other. And phenomenological inquiry came into practice. And phenomenological inquiry refers to using suitable methods to gather data to study phenomenology, writing about phenomenological experiences, involving specific methods and procedures to document this kind of inquiry. The epistemology of practice. How do you practice phenomenology? So this is where meditation and the idea of connecting to your consciousness comes into the picture. Then orientations in phenomenology. How are different spokes or various ideas of phenomenological experiences connected to each other? Then sources of meaning. How do you make meaning out of experiences? And this is where perceptions come in, because all these various 6 different spokes of phenomenological inquiry, they are thoroughly rooted in understanding perceptions. If we do not understand perceptions, we can't write about them. If we do not understand perceptions, we cannot put them into practice and understand how perceptions happen. If we do not understand perception, how do we gather meaning? So perception is the root of phenomenology and experience. Now, the next phase in phenomenology was existential phenomenology, and Merleau-Ponty was a pioneer in the field of existential phenomenology. Ponty understood that learning takes place within the reflection of inner self. So he understood that there is consciousness within, and that the center of any experience was one's body. And this learning is very similar to what The various tantric schools in India talk about the importance of understanding the body. So essentially Tantra in India is talking a lot about phenomenology. It is talking only about phenomenology. And individuals allowing a human to be intellectually subjective and explore their inner being was of paramount importance. Now this subjective, intellectual subjectivity was further drawn into subjective experience, that everybody experiences the same truth in different ways. Now that is the stand of the Indian phenomenology. The Westerners still remained in intellectual subjectivity. However, the Indian paradigms, as we will see later, they talked about how everybody experiences the same thing very differently. Coming back to the Western paradigm, the inner reflections produced by individuals can be studied alongside reflections of others, creating new experiences and reflections altogether. So essentially what the Western paradigm says is that individuals can be transformed from their learning environments and experiences. Now this is a very important takeaway for any of us, those are teachers, researchers, or work with any kind of human population, to engage them in learning, because transformation happens in learning environments through experiences. So basically emotions in a person's body are affected by the environment. What are emotions? Emotions are biochemistry. So if the external environment is different, the biochemistry of the body is different. And if the environment creates an emotion of anger within, the biochemistry is different. If the external environment creates an emotion of joy, the biochemistry is different. So we reach various states and various levels of experience where we touch various levels of consciousness based on the external environment we are present in, because that dictates how our internal environment is and vice versa. And we can also use our internal biochemistry to shift the outside. So while the Western philosophy is looking at how do you manipulate the external environment to change the internal, Indian philosophy is looking at how do you use the internal environment to change now the external. Briefly, quickly go over to understand what the phenomenological mind is, because this is what the transcendental phenomenology in the West draws from. The Western philosophy says is that we navigate the experience of time without getting lost somehow. It says we construct the idea of time ourselves and we are able to navigate through it without getting lost. And that is because of our experiences, of how we engage with our experiences and how we create our narratives out. Now, sensory organs such as eyes, nose, ear, mouth, skin, they absorb energy from physical stimulus. Then they turn into impulses sent to the brain. Then the brain releases some chemicals and a neuron pattern establishes. This is what the Westerners understood thoroughly. And through advances in neuroscience, the Western psychological movements, they kind of figured this out greatly. Now these chemical releases create our perception of the experience, and over a period of time cause conditioning of specific experiences. So what this means is that over a period of time, when the same experience happens again and again and again, we condition it, we become comfortable with it, we normalize it. And our bodies understand the outside world, and through this, we experience various degrees of consciousness within. So this is what the Westerners thought. The Westerners gave more importance to the outside world. They said whatever is happening outside us changes the biochemistry inside us. Now here is an example of how a human subject, a human being, understands phenomenology. At a very simple experience level, at a very simple level of perception, simple level of experience, if the human eye is observing a tree, what do we think about it? We think about the content of the experience, meaning through the act of seeing, we tend to think about things like, okay, trees are made up of wood, they're mostly carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Okay, that is what wood is. So, physicality, we're looking at the physicality and describing the content of it. But if you want to gather rich phenomenological description and interpretation, you have to look at the tree as you experience within your own consciousness, within this whole drama of the biochemistry inside you. So essentially, how you see the tree depends on how your filter is, the essence of the phenomenon, the lived experience of a tree. So when you're seeing a tree, you're not seeing a tree outside. Because if you have to see a tree, light has to fall on the tree, then it has to be reflected back onto your retina, then your retina, which is inside your eye, there has to be an inverted image on the retina, then the brain will invert the inverted image, and then you're able to see the image on your retina. And where is the retina? Retina is inside you. Likewise for all other sensory organs, whatever we are seeing, whatever we are hearing, whatever we are touching, whatever we are tasting and smelling, all of it is happening within us. So basically we see things the way we are. We don't see things, we don't feel things, we don't smell things, we don't touch things the way they are. We experience this whole rich phenomenological experience within us the way we are. So our biochemistry is extremely, extremely important. So again, O. Laughlin says the connections that bodies have with the environment and world around them through their emotions and senses allow bodies to become lived experiences. So then he says the body and the world becomes of the same fabric. So again, if you see for the Westerners, the environment, outside environment is extremely important. Because they're coming from a construct where the outside is impacting the inside. And the observer experiences a set of sublime perceptions that are connected to emotions from heightened state of alertness and awareness of one's own body as lived experience. Now, I say this is my own statement. I say this because the experiences are in the observer, they are not in the outside environment. These perceptions that are closely connected to our own emotions and creating different states of alertness and awareness in our own body, they're all within us. Phenomenology and how it situates itself with philosophy of science. Now, if you are familiar with philosophy of science, you know that it is quite empirical, quite quantitative. Science is quite rational. And that is in the first layer. But as you go deeper and deeper into philosophy of science, the next layer is interpretivism. You have to interpret. Then realism and relativism. How does one thing stand? Context comes into picture. How is something in relation to something else? This is where we use statistics to kind of help understand that whatever results have been obtained in scientific studies and analysis are relevant only to that context. When you take it out of that context, it may or may not be valid. Then comes the zone of pragmatism, hermeneutics, constructivism, phenomenology. And I've been talking about hermeneutics quite a bit, and the pragmatic approach of philosophy, very practical approach of philosophy, then how knowledge is constructed. This is the next outer circle. Then the final outer structure in the development of philosophy in the West is instrumentalism, structuralism, psychoanalytical theories, post-structuralism, deconstructionism, existentialism. Now this existentialism is what Merleau-Ponty is talking about, where the phenomenological aspects were taken and further drawn into understanding the body in a better manner. So this is a very brief sketch of how philosophy has developed in the Western structure, in the Western system. Now, there are a lot of strategies to study all these various aspects of philosophy. And like I showed you earlier, the innermost ring is empirical research and theoretical research. Then comes quantitative, qualitative, and multi-method research. Then comes case study research, longitudinal research, cross-sectional research. Finally, the outer segment is action research, critical theory research, phenomenological research, narrative research, hermeneutic research, ethnographic research, comparative research, historical research. So as the field of philosophy started expanding and growing in the West, the approaches required to study these fields also have grown quite a bit. Now let us try to understand phenomenology in India. And I would like to start by telling you that all phenomenology in India is rooted in understanding the inner experience. The Westerners are understanding the inner experience through the outer. And we, Indians, are trying to understand for thousands of years. We've tried to understand the outer manifestation through our inner. So, our seers, our knowledge constructors, our rishis, our gurus have always believed that if you change your inside, you can change your outside. And Vaisheshika talks about many realities, many possibilities. Then came the school called Samkhya, very important school, because this particular school or way of lived experiences has impacted every other school of thought. This is the enumeration school, which posited a dualism between matter as the feminine Prakriti and the self, the consciousness, as Purusha. And Samkhya says both are real. They're ontologically, classification-wise different, but both are real. And Samkhya is the school that gave Indian philosophy the idea of gunas. We say three gunas. Tamas, Rajas, Sattva. Tamas, the state of being inert. Rajas, the state of activity. And then Sattva, the state of bliss. Then Yoga, the school of Patanjali, which assumes the metaphysics of Samkhya but understands it through the body. And out of Samkhya and Yoga, a lot of these fundamentals join Tantra on the other side in enumerating the experiences within. So that is a totally different branch of understanding in India. We're not looking at Tantra specifically here. We're just looking at the darshanas of understanding. So both Yoga, Samkhya play a very important role in Tantra as well. Then comes Purva Mimamsa. Purva Mimamsa is the tradition of Vedic exegesis, which assumes the reality of the many. Meaning, this is a school that focuses greatly on external rituals. This is very much like the Western school of thoughts, of phenomenology, which assume that external rituals are very important. So you can draw a parallel between the Western phenomenology and the Indian phenomenology through Purva Mimamsa. The ritual is important. The external environment is very important for Purva Mimamsans. Then comes Uttara Mimamsa or Vedanta, the tradition which develops from Upanishads and consists of three major perspectives: Advaita Vedanta, Vishishta Advaita, and Dvaita Advaita. Advaita Vedanta, its proponents believe that there is universal consciousness called Brahman, and there is an individual consciousness within each one of us called Atman, and the Brahman, Atman can merge with each other. They are one and the same. They can merge with each other. Vishishtadvaita, it believes that there is a universal consciousness and that there is an individual consciousness, but they cannot merge with each other. The universal consciousness, the God principle, and the human consciousness, they cannot merge with each other. Then there is Dvaita. Proponents of Dvaita, they believe that there is universal consciousness and that there is an individual consciousness. They are different from each other. They cannot merge with each other. Now, Vishishtadvaita believes that they are one and the same, but they can't merge with each other. Dvaita believes that they are different. They can't merge with each other. Now, let us look at this particular slide to help decipher and help ourselves understand how perception is central to Indian philosophy. Now let us look at something like Samkhya as well as Yoga. Both of these schools of thought, perception is central. Inner work. Anybody who is a proponent of any of these schools will talk to you about the importance of doing inner work. So what they mean is that if you change the inner perceptions, the inferences you draw out of these inner perceptions will be different, and how these perceptions impact your word also becomes very different, because if you have clarity in perception, you have clarity in your word. And you can see that perception is contributing, not only drawing, it is contributing to knowledge through inference and word, and all the three, word, inference and perception, are considered as reliable proofs for knowledge construction. Now if you look at the older school, Nyaya, or the first school that we kind of looked at, there is a comparison because it's about logic. So along with the inference and word also came comparison and contrast, because it is about tarka, it is about logic. So there will be comparison. So perception there pulls from comparison, contributes to comparison. Perception there pulls from inference, gives to inference. Perception there pulls from word, and all the four are considered reliable sources. Now finally, let's look at the Dvaita school, or school of dualism, which said the universal consciousness and the individual consciousness are different. They can't even merge with each other. They're just different. Now this school also draws from perception into inference, and also pulls spoken word as a reliable source. But look at this, all of them are saying perception is the most important through which either an inference or word can be drawn. So basically all of Indian philosophy is talking about the importance of experiences, internal experiences. And then they're using the internal experiences to figure out how to reshape the external experience. Now there are several proofs that Indian systems accept. Perception is called pratyaksha pramana. Inference is called anumana pramana. Comparison and analogy is called upamana. Postulation, derivation from circumstances is called ardhapati. Non-perception, negative cognitive proofs that are not from perception but from thinking, thought, are called anupalabdhi. Then finally is scriptural testimony, verbal testimony from past and present reliable experts. This is called as shabda. So this is why a guru is important, because the guru is rooted in shabda. The guru is testimony of past and present reliable experience. So this is why a guru is central to this phenomenological construct of knowledge construction in India. So these are various darshanas and various proofs that they accept, that I've shown you in the table. I'm not going to go into in-depth details of this. I'm going to leave it to you to look into it and make meaning out of how these schools are different from each other. But basically the point is for you to understand that there's many differences in phenomenological constructs within the schools, but all of them look at perception as the central in understanding how we construct knowledge and how we understand what we understand. Cause and effect has been central to a lot of philosophy in the West. This difference between cause and effect is one quality or form. If the effect exists in the cause, it is called Satkaryavada. That is the theory of presence of the effect in the cause prior to its manifestation. So the effect and the cause are with each other. Now this Satkaryavada can be looked at in two different ways, Parinamavada and Vivartavada. In Parinamavada, whatever we think is the cause for something is changing into the effect. For example, the people that were proponents of this school of understanding cause and effect, they said, well, clay is turning into pot. Clay is the cause. The final effect is the pot. So according to Parinamavada, cause and effect is the same. But according to Vivartavada, cause and effect are different. Now what is Vivartavada? Vivartavada can be interpreted to understand transformation, alteration, illusion. The relation between an actual object and its reflection within a mirror is a very good example for Vivartavada. You may be standing in front of a mirror and looking at your reflection. You are the actual object and there is a reflection in the mirror. But you are not turning into the reflection in the mirror. You and the reflection in the mirror are two different things. The proponents of this school of thought talk to you about things like a rope looking like a snake. They tell you about how, if you're walking in the dark and there's a rope lying, based on your inner fears, you might think that it is a snake when it in fact is a rope. So here, the effect and the cause are different, whereas in Parinamavada, the cause is changing into an effect. Now to sum up the phenomenology in the Indian context, whatever we are seeing, whatever we are touching, whatever we are feeling, whatever we are smelling, tasting, hearing, everything is happening within us. We see things the way we are. We don't see things the way they are. Because all the perception is inside us. Perception is not outside us. Whatever exists outside us is a mere reflection of what is happening inside us. Now, this is the philosophy that led to the development of what we call yantras. Yantras are an imprint of our own vital force system, the life force that exists within us. I'm not going to go into details of how a yantra is constructed and all that, but I've given you brief details. If you want to pause and read through it to understand further, it can be done. But all these yantras that are placed in temples, they come from the Indian phenomenological understanding that our internal and external mimic each other. So whatever exists in our body also exists in the outside cosmos. And they created these yantras as a tool to connect the universal consciousness to our consciousness. So basically this yantra, the tool, which is a geometric pattern, mimics our body so that it can become a portal for our body to connect with universal consciousness. A very important form of such a yantra is the Sri Chakra, what is known as the Sri Chakra, which connects the vital force at 108 points in our body, and this has been prevalent in all ancient civilizations, not just in India. Different civilizations call it with different names. The Western civilizations have called it the flower of life, whereas in India we call it the Sri Chakra. So basically Indian systems look at yantra, tantra, mantra. Yantra is the geometrical pattern that mimics a body. Tantra is the science that through creation of space enables this geometric pattern to find semblance with our own space within. Mantra is sound. So what a mantra does with sound, Tantra does it with understanding of space. And Yantra is the geometrical pattern that is required by both Tantra and Mantra to be able to function. Now, in Indian phenomenology, there is connection between various aspects of learning. They are not separate from each other. All of it is the same process. So phenomenology will connect something like evolution to Dashavataram, to ecology, to the biochemistry within the body, to mathematics, and then finally sacred geometry, understanding of all the yantras. So Indian learning systems were very much looped. They were full circles. Finally, Indian systems, phenomenology of Indian systems, and this aspect is very important for a teacher or an educator. These systems did not just look at 5 sensory perceptions, they also looked at 2 more. They also looked at proprioception and vestibular balance, and they put the elements in alignment with these sensory perceptions. So according to the Indian systems, and especially the Buddhist systems in the Indian traditions, earth is associated with smell, water is associated with taste, fire is associated with the ability to see, sight, wind is associated with touch, ether or akasha is associated with sound, light is associated with balance, and cosmic energy is associated with awareness. So as teachers, it's very important for us to understand that there are not 5 sensory perceptions but 7 sensory perceptions. And balance sets in with the vestibular perception, and awareness sets in with body awareness. So once a person becomes aware of their own body, their own proprioception, that is when they understand themselves thoroughly. And according to majority of all our Indian systems, clarity in perception determines profoundness of experience. We are understood to have 5 different kosha. In the Buddhist systems they talk about 7 koshas, but in the Sanatana Dharma they talk about 5 koshas or 5 layers. First is the layer of the body called Annamaya Kosha. Second is the layer of life force called Pranamaya Kosha. Third is the layer of the mind called Manomaya Kosha. Fourth is the layer of intellect and thought called Vijnanamaya Kosha. Fifth is the layer of bliss called Anandamaya Kosha. These are also classified as awake states, dream state, and deep sleep state, where consciousness is merging into the ever-pervading universal consciousness. Now, perception exists at various levels and gets disturbed also at various levels. And the clarity in how you perceive determines the profoundness of your experience. The more clarity of perception you have, the more profound your experience. And in summary, I'd like to take you back to philosophy of science, connect all of it back to the Western paradigm of philosophy that we talked about a little while ago. In summary, I'd like to loop all this learning back to the Western paradigm of phenomenology, where we were talking about the philosophy of science, and in structure of scientific revolutions, Kuhn, talks about how new paradigms are created in science. I'm not going to go into the depths of it, but give you a very brief gist of it so you have an idea of understanding that. What happens in science is that there's a paradigm. There's a certain way you do a certain thing. And you make measurements, you articulate theory, you make predictions. All this happens in science. So when this paradigm doesn't work, when something goes different from how typically things are done, first a scientist will blame the apparatus, then set aside the problem, then make changes to the paradigm, shift, like how they're doing things. Then the shift becomes too problematic, and faith in the original paradigm is shaken. Then the scientist realizes that, oh wow, how I was doing it earlier is not the solution in all circumstances. Then there's a change in worldview, a gestalt shift, an aha moment, and the problem is seen from a different perspective. Perception is changed, and a new paradigm is explored. And what happens in this pre-paradigm phase? So to reach this phase, alternative concepts, competing concepts people look at, they gather facts. It's a very chaotic period because they're shifting from one way of doing things to a new way of doing things. But then an equilibrium sets in and they return to a new routine. And this whole revolution that went from one way of doing things to challenging that way of doing, making changes, then finally going through chaos and coming into acceptance, that becomes invisible. And this becomes a new paradigm. And then it works well till hits a bottleneck again, and then the whole process begins again. And this is how changes have happened in the world all the time. Finally, I'd like to summarize all our learning with what the Taittiriya Upanishad says through Brahmananda Valli, that from the Brahman, the universal consciousness, evolved space. From space evolved air, from air came fire, from fire came water, from water evolved earth, from earth came medicines, from medicines came food, and from food came human beings. And this understanding, this deep knowledge that our ancients had about how consciousness is related to the human being, this is central to phenomenology in India. In summary, what I would want to tell you is that Western phenomenology understands experience from the external to the internal, whereas the Indian phenomenology understands experience from internal to external. I hope you've understood the differences and have developed appreciation for both the systems, because both are important. I hope great learning experience for you as you progress through philosophy, especially through phenomenology.